The conference room fell silent as the small boy reached into his worn school bag. Every executive, every camera, every shareholder leaned forward. The billionaire's face had already gone pale, but when the child pulled out a faded photograph and held it up to the light, something broke in the room. In the picture, a young woman cradled a newborn baby, her smile radiant despite her simple clothes. And in the background, unmistakable even after all these years, stood a younger version of the man who now controlled an empire worth billions. The boy's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "This is my grandmother. And you said you've never seen her before in your life." 2 days earlier, the intersection of Madison and 52nd Street was just another corner in Manhattan where the wealthy and the desperate occupied the same few square feet, but lived in completely different worlds. Victoria Chin had been sitting there for 3 years, her cardboard sign propped against the brick wall, her weathered hands holding a paper cup that rarely filled with more than a few dollars a day. She was 73 years old, and every line on her face told a story of survival that nobody bothered to read. Most people walked past her like she was part of the architecture, but Victoria didn't mind the invisibility anymore. She'd learned that being unseen was sometimes safer than being noticed. What she did mind was the cold. November in New York wasn't forgiving, and her joints ached in ways that made every movement a negotiation with pain. She wrapped her thin jacket tighter and watched the crowd surge past, their expensive shoes clicking against the pavement, their voices rising and falling in conversations about stock prices and dinner reservations and weekend plans in the Hamptons. She used to have weekend plans too, once upon a time. She used to have a home and a son and a future that looked nothing like this corner. That morning, a black SUV pulled up to the curb across the street, idling in a no-parking zone with the kind of confidence that said the rules didn't apply. Victoria noticed it because noticing everything was how you survived on the streets. You learned to read danger in the tilt of a head, opportunity in the distraction of a crowd, and trouble in vehicles that stayed too long in one place. The SUV's windows were tinted dark, and for a moment, Victoria felt the old instinct kick in, the one that said move, relocate, disappear. But her legs were too stiff this morning, and she was too tired to chase shadows. The passenger door opened, and a boy stepped out. He couldn't have been more than 12 years old, wearing a school uniform that had been washed so many times the blue blazer had faded to gray. His backpack was patched with duct tape, and his shoes were clean but worn through at the heels. He looked both ways before crossing the street, not toward the expensive boutiques or the coffee shops, but directly toward Victoria. Her instinct said trouble, but her heart said something different when she saw his face up close. There was something familiar in the shape of his eyes, in the way he carried himself, with a careful dignity despite his obvious poverty. The boy stopped 3 feet away and studied her with an intensity that made Victoria uncomfortable. Most people avoided eye contact, treating her like a piece of furniture or a problem to step around. But this child looked at her like he was solving a puzzle, his dark eyes moving from her face to her hands to the small bundle of belongings she kept in a garbage bag beside her. "Are you Victoria Chin?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. Victoria's blood went cold. Nobody on the streets used her full name. Nobody on the streets knew her full name. She'd been careful, so careful, to never give more than a first name, to never mention where she came from or who she used to be. The past was a trap, and she'd spent years making sure it couldn't find her. "Who's asking?" she said, her voice rougher than she intended. The boy reached into his backpack and pulled out a piece of paper, creased and worn like he'd folded and unfolded it 100 times. "My name is Daniel. I think you're my grandmother." Victoria's hand started shaking, and it had nothing to do with the cold. She stared at this child, at the shape of his face that suddenly made terrible sense, at the hope and fear mixing in his expression. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he had the wrong person, that she was nobody's grandmother, because being nobody was the only way she'd survived this long. But the words stuck in her throat, because she was looking at a ghost, at a possibility she'd buried 30 years ago. "I don't have any family," she whispered, but the lie felt like swallowing glass. Daniel sat down beside her on the cold pavement, not afraid of the dirt or the smell or the judgment of the people walking past. He unfolded the paper carefully, and Victoria saw it was a photograph, old and faded, the colors bleeding into each other like a watercolor, painting left in the rain. In the picture, a young woman held a newborn baby, her face exhausted but glowing with new mother love. Victoria recognized herself instantly, recognized that moment even though it was from another lifetime. She was 28 years old in that photo, holding her son for the first time, believing that love would be enough to protect them both. "Where did you get this?" Victoria asked, her voice breaking. "My mother kept it," Daniel said. "She died 6 months ago. Before she died, she told me about you. She said you disappeared when I was a baby, and nobody knew where you went. She said I should find you if anything happened to her." Victoria closed her eyes against the tears that were coming whether she wanted them or not. 6 months. This child had been alone for 6 months, and she hadn't known, hadn't been there, hadn't been the grandmother he needed because she'd been too busy being invisible. "Why now?" she asked. "Why find me now?" Daniel looked down at his hands. "Because tomorrow, my father is announcing something big. There's going to be a press conference at his company headquarters. Everyone's going to be there. All the media, all the important people. And I need you to be there too." "Your father," Victoria repeated slowly, the pieces starting to fall into place in a pattern she didn't want to see. "Who is your father, Daniel?" The boy met her eyes, and in that moment, Victoria saw the truth she'd been running from for 3 decades. "Jonathan Whitmore," Daniel said. "He's a billionaire now. He owns Whitmore Global Industries, and he's about to announce his political campaign for governor." The name hit Victoria like a physical blow. Jonathan, her son, the baby she'd held in that photograph, had grown into a man she wouldn't recognize, had built an empire on a foundation she couldn't begin to imagine, had created a life so far removed from her that they might as well have lived on different planets. And he'd had a child, which meant Victoria was exactly what Daniel said she was, a grandmother who'd missed everything. "Does he know you're here?" Victoria asked carefully, because nothing about this made sense. If Jonathan was a billionaire, if he had the kind of power and resources that came with running a global company, why was his son wearing patched clothes and riding in an old SUV? Why was this child searching for a homeless woman on a street corner instead of living in a mansion somewhere? Daniel's expression hardened, and suddenly he looked much older than 12. "He doesn't know I exist," he said quietly. "Or at least, he pretends he doesn't. My mother was his secretary 20 years ago. They had a relationship, and I was born, but he was already engaged to someone else by then. Someone from the right family, with the right connections. He gave my mother money to go away and never contact him again. She took it because she didn't have a choice, and she raised me by herself until the cancer got too bad." Victoria felt rage building in her chest, hot and fierce, and directed at a son she hadn't seen in 30 years. She'd made mistakes, terrible mistakes that had led to this corner and this life, but she'd never abandoned her child. She'd lost him through circumstances and choices that still haunted her every day, but she'd never looked at her son and decided he wasn't worth the inconvenience. "And now you want me at this press conference," Victoria said. "Why? What do you think will happen?" Daniel pulled out another photograph, this one more recent, printed on regular paper like it had come from a computer. It showed Jonathan Whitmore standing behind a podium, his smile perfect, his suit expensive, his whole appearance carefully crafted to project success and trustworthiness. Behind him stood an elegant woman and 2 teenage children, the picture of our ideal family. The caption read, "Jonathan Whitmore announces exploratory committee for gubernatorial campaign." "He's going to talk about family values," Daniel said, his voice tight with emotion, "about protecting children and strengthening communities, and all these things he's never actually done. And everyone's going to believe him because he looks the part and sounds the part and has the right kind of family standing behind him. But it's all a lie, and I'm tired of being the secret he buried." Victoria understood then what this child was asking for, what he needed from her. He needed a witness, someone who could stand beside him and confirm that yes, this boy existed. Yes, Jonathan Whitmore had a history he wanted to erase. Yes, the perfect image was built on a foundation of denial and abandonment. But what Daniel didn't understand was that Victoria's presence wouldn't help his case. She was a homeless woman with no credibility, no power, no voice that anyone would listen to. She would be easy to dismiss, easy to explain away as a confused old woman or opportunist, trying to extort money from a wealthy family. "Daniel," she said gently, "I don't think you understand what you're asking. Your father doesn't know me anymore. It's been 30 years since I saw him last. I left when he was just a little older than you are now, and I had my reasons, but they're complicated and they're painful, and they're not going to make your case stronger. If I show up at that press conference, I'll just be another problem for his PR team to handle. They'll call security. They'll remove me, and you'll be left even more alone than you are now." "That's why I have this," Daniel said, pulling out the original photograph again, the one of Victoria holding baby Jonathan. "Look at the background." Victoria looked closer at the photo she'd seen 1,000 times in her memory. Behind her younger self, partially visible through the hospital room door, stood a man. She'd never paid attention to that figure before, had always focused on herself and her baby, but now she saw him clearly. A young man in his early 20s, visiting hours over, standing in the hallway with flowers in his hand and uncertainty on his face. It was Jonathan's father, Robert Whitmore Sr., the man Victoria had loved and lost, the man who'd promised her everything and given her nothing but heartbreak. "I don't understand," Victoria said. "Everyone thinks Jonathan came from nothing," Daniel explained. "That's his whole story. The self-made billionaire who built an empire from scratch. But that's not true, is it? His father was Robert Whitmore Sr., old money, connected families, the whole thing. And you were together with Robert when Jonathan was born. This photo proves it. Jonathan's entire origin story is a lie." Victoria felt the world tilting beneath her. She'd never told anyone the full truth about Jonathan's father, had let people assume what they wanted about the circumstances of her son's birth. Robert had been engaged to someone else when they'd met, just like Jonathan would be decades later with Daniel's mother. History repeating itself in the cruelest possible way. Robert had promised to leave his fiancée, had promised to acknowledge Jonathan as his son, but when the pressure came from his family and his social circle, he'd chosen the easier path. He'd married the suitable woman, built the expected life, and left Victoria to raise their son alone with nothing but a small settlement that barely covered the hospital bills. "Jonathan doesn't want anyone to know about Robert," Victoria said slowly, understanding dawning. "Because Robert's family is still powerful, still connected. And if people knew Jonathan was Robert Whitmore's illegitimate son, it would complicate everything. The inheritance questions, the social standing, the political connections." "Exactly," Daniel said. "Jonathan built his whole image on being the outsider who made it through brilliance and hard work. But he started with advantages he won't admit to. And he's doing to me exactly what his father did to him. He's pretending I don't exist because acknowledging me would mess up the story he's selling." Victoria looked at this remarkable child who'd somehow figured out more about family history and political strategy than most adults could grasp. "How do you know all this?" she asked. "My mother told me some of it before she died," Daniel said. "And I'm good with computers. I've been researching, putting pieces together. Jonathan's company has SEC filings, property records, old news articles. If you know where to look, you can find the connections. Robert Whitmore Sr. was one of the early investors in Jonathan's first company. Not a lot of money, and he hid it through shell corporations, but it was there. Just enough to get Jonathan started, to give him the advantage he needed. And then Robert died before Jonathan got really famous, so nobody asked too many questions. And this is where everything shifted, because now it wasn't just about a boy trying to find his father. It was about the truth they buried for years, the lies that built empires, and the people who got erased from the story so the powerful could keep their perfect image intact. Victoria knew she should say no. Every instinct for self-preservation told her to send this boy away, to stay invisible, to protect herself from the inevitable disaster that came from challenging people with money and power. But looking at Daniel's face, seeing the desperate hope mixed with determination, she couldn't do it. This child had lost his mother, had been denied by his father, had spent months alone trying to figure out how to make someone acknowledge that he mattered. And Victoria had failed her own son 30 years ago by disappearing when things got hard. She couldn't fail her grandson, too. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll go with you to the press conference. But Daniel, you need to understand something. This probably won't work the way you're hoping. Your father has lawyers and PR people and security teams. He spent decades building walls around himself, and those walls are designed to keep people like us out." Daniel smiled, and it was the saddest, oldest smile Victoria had ever seen on a child's face. "I know," he said, "but I have to try. Because if I don't try, then I'm just accepting that some people matter and some people don't. And I can't accept that." The SUV driver, an older woman Victoria now noticed watching them carefully, stepped out and approached. "Daniel," she said gently, "we need to go. Your father's advance team will be at the venue soon, and we have to get there first." Victoria stood up slowly, her joints protesting every movement. She gathered her few belongings into her garbage bag, everything she owned in the world fitting into one small bundle. Daniel helped her into the SUV, and as they pulled away from the corner that had been her home for 3 years, Victoria watched the city slide past the window and wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life or finally doing something right. The woman driving introduced herself as Margaret Torres, Daniel's mother's best friend and the person who'd been taking care of him since the funeral. "I tried to talk him out of this," Margaret said quietly, glancing at Victoria in the rearview mirror. "But he's stubborn, just like his mother was. And maybe he's right. Maybe it's time someone told the truth." They drove to a church basement in Queens where Margaret had been volunteering. There was a shower, clean clothes donated by the congregation, and a small room where Victoria could prepare herself. She stood under the hot water for the first time in months, watching years of street dirt circle the drain, trying to wash away the shame and fear that clung to her skin like a second layer. When she emerged, Margaret had laid out simple but clean clothes: dark pants, a modest blouse, a jacket that almost fit. Victoria caught sight of herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked old, worn down by life, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there in years. Purpose, maybe, or just the desperate hope that she could still matter to someone. Daniel was waiting for her in the church kitchen, his own clothes changed to a slightly better uniform, his hair combed carefully. He handed her a folder full of documents: birth certificates, the photographs, printed emails he'd recovered from his mother's old computer, property records showing the connections between Robert Whitmore Sr. and Jonathan's early business ventures. The boy had built a case file like a detective, every piece of evidence carefully organized and documented. "I'm not going to ambush him randomly," Daniel explained. "The press conference is at 2 p.m. They'll do the announcement, take some questions from the approved journalists, and then there's a reception afterward for donors and supporters. That's when I'll approach him, when there are enough witnesses that he can't just have security throw me out without it looking bad." "And you want me there for what?" Victoria asked. "To prove I'm telling the truth," Daniel said. "He can deny knowing my mother. He can say the photographs are fake or that I'm just some kid trying to scam him. But you're his mother. Even if he hasn't seen you in 30 years, there will be people there who remember you, who know the family history. Your presence makes it harder for him to just dismiss everything." Victoria wasn't sure that was true, but she didn't argue. They had a few hours before the press conference, and Margaret suggested they rest, eat something, prepare mentally for what was coming. But Victoria couldn't rest. She kept looking at the photographs Daniel had given her, kept studying the face of her son as he'd become, trying to reconcile the baby she'd held with the powerful man he'd grown into. She'd left when Jonathan was 13 years old, in the middle of the night, with nothing but a suitcase and a heart full of guilt. Robert Whitmore Sr. had died suddenly, and his legitimate family had contested the small trust fund he'd set up for Jonathan. The lawyers and the court battles and the vicious gossip had been destroying her son's childhood, turning him into a target at school, making every day a fight. Victoria had thought, in her desperate and broken way of thinking, that Jonathan would be better off if she disappeared. That without her there as a reminder of Robert's affair, the legitimate Whitmore family might accept Jonathan, might give him the opportunities and advantages he deserved. She'd thought she was sacrificing herself for his future. It had been the worst decision of her life. Within a year of her disappearance, she'd lost everything. Her home, her job, her identity. She'd spiraled into depression and poverty, unable to claw her way back up, too ashamed to reach out to her son and admit she'd made a terrible mistake. She told herself he was better off without her, that he'd moved on, that showing up again would only hurt him worse. And so the years had passed, and the distance had grown, and eventually Victoria had accepted that she'd lost her son forever. Now, sitting in a church basement in Queens, she realized that Jonathan had taken her abandonment and turned it into fuel. He'd built an empire, maybe to prove he didn't need her, maybe to prove he didn't need anyone. He'd become exactly the kind of man who could deny his own child because acknowledging weakness or complicated truths didn't fit the image he'd created. And Victoria knew, with a clarity that hurt like a knife to the chest, that she'd helped make him that way. At 1:30, they climbed back into the SUV and headed toward Midtown. Whitmore Global Industries occupied a gleaming skyscraper on Park Avenue, all glass and steel and reflected clouds. The lobby was already filling with people, journalists with cameras and microphones, donors in expensive suits, political operatives with earpieces and clipboards. Security was tight, with metal detectors and credential checks, and a general atmosphere of controlled chaos. Margaret had somehow obtained visitor passes, probably through her church connections or sheer determination. They made it through security without incident, though Victoria saw the guard's eyes linger on her, taking in her charity store clothes and weathered appearance, clearly wondering if she belonged in this space. Daniel walked between her and Margaret, his small hand finding Victoria's and squeezing tight. She squeezed back, drawing strength from this child's courage. The press conference was being held in the building's largest conference room, a space designed to impress, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the Manhattan skyline. Rows of chairs faced a raised platform where a podium, bearing the Whitmore Global logo, waited. Behind it, a banner proclaimed, "Building Tomorrow's Communities Today." The irony of that slogan wasn't lost on Victoria. They found seats in the back, trying to be invisible in a crowd of very visible people. Victoria kept her head down, afraid that someone might recognize her, that security might decide they didn't belong and escort them out before anything could happen. But the crowd was focused on the front of the room, on the platform where the main event would unfold. At precisely 2 p.m., the lights dimmed and a video began playing on screens mounted around the room. It showed Whitmore Global's achievements, the buildings they constructed, the jobs they created, the communities they'd revitalized. Then it shifted to Jonathan's personal story, the narrative Victoria now knew was half-truth and half-fiction. The self-made man who'd overcome poverty and obstacles to build an empire. The devoted family man with a beautiful wife and accomplished children. The visionary leader ready to bring his business success to public service. When the video ended, Jonathan Whitmore walked onto the platform, and Victoria's breath caught in her throat. He was 53 years old now, his hair silvering at the temples, his presence commanding in the way of people accustomed to being listened to. She could see traces of the boy she'd raised in the shape of his face, the way he held his shoulders, but everything else was foreign. This was a stranger wearing her son's bones. The family followed him onto the platform, his wife Catherine, poised and perfect in a designer suit, his daughter Amanda, 21 and already working in the family business, his son Robert, 19 and heading to Princeton in the fall. They positioned themselves behind Jonathan like a commercial for success, their smiles practiced and their body language carefully staged. Jonathan's speech was polished and professional, hitting all the right notes about economic opportunity and education reform and infrastructure investment. He talked about his humble beginnings, carefully omitting any mention of Robert Whitmore Sr. or the advantages he'd received. He talked about family values and the importance of supporting working parents, words that rang hollow to Victoria knowing he'd abandoned his own child. The journalists ate it up, scribbling notes and nodding along, buying the story he was selling. When the formal announcement ended, Jonathan opened the floor for questions. The approved journalists asked softball questions about policy positions and campaign strategy. Jonathan answered smoothly, his team having clearly prepared him for every possible angle. Then he wrapped up the Q&A section and invited everyone to the reception in the adjacent room, where they could continue conversations over champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The crowd began moving toward the reception space, a controlled migration of power and influence. Daniel stood up, his jaw set with determination, and Victoria realized this was it. This was the moment her grandson had been planning for, the confrontation that would either expose the truth or destroy what was left of their family. "Wait," Victoria said, gripping Daniel's arm. "Maybe we should think about this more. Once you do this, there's no taking it back." Daniel looked at her with those old, sad eyes. "Grandma," he said, and the word made Victoria's heart break and soar at the same time. "I've been invisible my whole life. Just this once, I want to be seen." They moved through the crowd toward the front of the room, where Jonathan stood surrounded by advisors and donors. Margaret stayed close, her presence a silent support. As they approached, Victoria saw Jonathan's head of security notice them, saw him speak into his earpiece, saw the subtle shift in the team's body language that meant they'd identified a potential problem. But before security could intervene, Daniel stepped forward into the small cleared space around Jonathan and spoke in a voice that carried across the room with surprising strength. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "I'm your son." The room didn't exactly go silent, the way it does in movies. Instead, there was a ripple of confused murmuring, people trying to figure out if this was some kind of stunt or protest. Jonathan's smile never wavered, his media training kicking in as he looked down at this small boy with polite confusion. "I think there's been some mistake, son," he said, the word son landing like acid on Victoria's ears. "I don't know you." "My name is Daniel Martinez," the boy continued, pulling out the folder he'd been carrying. "My mother was Elena Martinez. She worked as your executive secretary 20 years ago. You had a relationship with her, and I was born 9 months after she left your employment. She has documentation, photographs, everything proving that you're my father." Jonathan's team moved quickly, his press secretary stepping forward with a prepared smile. "This is clearly an unfortunate misunderstanding," she said smoothly. "Mr. Whitmore receives many claims of this nature, and while we sympathize with this young man's situation, we cannot entertain baseless accusations during a professional event. Security will be happy to escort you to the appropriate channels for—" "I have a photograph," Daniel said, louder now, holding up the image of his mother and Jonathan together at a company event. "And I have her employment records, showing she was terminated 2 weeks after you found out she was pregnant. And I have the settlement agreement you made her sign, the one where you paid her $50,000 to never contact you again." The murmuring grew louder. Journalists were pulling out their phones, recording now, sensing a story. Jonathan's expression hardened, the polished facade cracking just slightly. "Young man, I don't know what you've been told or who put you up to this, but you're mistaken. I've never seen you before, and these accusations are completely false. Security, please escort this child and his companions out of the building." 2 large security guards moved toward Daniel, and Victoria felt Margaret tense beside her, ready to fight for this boy. But Victoria stepped forward first, moving to stand beside her grandson, placing herself between him and the approaching guards. "Jonathan," she said quietly, and that one word, his name in her voice, made him freeze. For the first time since he'd stepped onto the platform, Jonathan Whitmore looked uncertain. His eyes found Victoria's face, and she watched as recognition fought with denial, as the past collided with the present in a space he'd carefully controlled for decades. "Mom," he whispered, so quietly only Victoria and the people closest to them could hear. "Hello, Jonathan," Victoria said. "It's been a long time." The room had definitely gone quiet now, everyone sensing they were witnessing something significant, something unplanned and real in a space usually reserved for carefully scripted performances. Jonathan's wife stepped forward, confused, looking between her husband and this homeless-looking woman claiming to be his mother. "Jonathan," Catherine said, "what's going on?" But Jonathan couldn't seem to find words. He just stared at Victoria like she was a ghost, like her existence violated some fundamental law of the universe he'd built. His press secretary tried to regain control, speaking into her earpiece, probably calling for more security or legal support. Daniel seized the moment of confusion. "Mr. Whitmore says he's never seen this woman before," he said loudly, addressing the crowd of journalists now openly recording everything. But that's impossible, because this woman is Victoria Chun, his mother. The mother he's never mentioned in any interview or biography. The mother who disappeared 30 years ago and ended up homeless on the streets of Manhattan while he built a billion-dollar empire. That's enough. Jonathan finally found his voice, sharp and commanding. This is harassment, and it's completely inappropriate. I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but... It's not a scam, Victoria interrupted, surprised by the strength in her own voice. I am your mother, Jonathan. I left you when you were 13 years old, and it was the worst mistake of my life. But I am standing here now, and I am not going to let you deny this boy the way your father denied you. Jonathan's face went pale at the mention of his father. You have no right, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You gave up your rights when you abandoned me. You don't get to come back now and... I know, Victoria said, tears starting to fall despite her best efforts to stay strong. I know I have no right to anything from you. I destroyed that when I left. But Daniel has rights. He's your son, Jonathan. Your blood. And he deserves better than what we got. Better than the cycle of denial and abandonment that's been passed down through this family like a curse. The crowd was completely silent now, camera phones capturing every moment, journalists understanding they were witnessing a massive story unfolding in real time. Jonathan's campaign team looked panicked, his wife looked shocked, and his legitimate children looked confused and hurt, their perfect family narrative shattering in front of their eyes. Prove it, Jonathan said finally, his voice cold. Prove you're my mother. Prove he's my son. Because all I see is a desperate woman and a child who've been coached to tell a convincing story. Daniel reached into his school bag with steady hands, and Victoria remembered what he'd told her about the photograph, about the proof he'd been carrying all this time. He pulled out the worn, faded picture and held it up high enough for everyone to see. This is proof, Daniel said. This photograph shows Victoria Chun holding a newborn baby 40 years ago. That baby is you, Mr. Whitmore. And if you look closely at the background, you can see a man standing in the hospital corridor. That man is Robert Whitmore Sr., your father. The father you've never acknowledged publicly because it doesn't fit your self-made story. He walked forward and handed the photograph directly to Jonathan, who took it with shaking hands. Victoria watched her son's face as he studied the image, saw the recognition and pain and anger all flash across his features. She knew he remembered that photograph, or others like it. She knew he couldn't deny what he was seeing. Robert Whitmore Sr. was old money, Daniel continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing. Connected families, political influence, everything you claim you didn't have. He was married to someone else when you were born, which is why your mother raised you alone. But he provided support, financial backing, the seed money for your first business ventures. You're not self-made, Mr. Whitmore. You had advantages you won't admit to, and you used them to build an empire. And now you're doing to me exactly what your father did to you, pretending I don't exist because it's convenient. Jonathan stared at the photograph for a long moment, his hands trembling slightly. When he looked up, his eyes found Victoria's, and in them she saw the 13-year-old boy she'd left behind, the child who'd woken up one morning to find his mother gone without explanation or goodbye. You have no idea what you've done, Jonathan said quietly, speaking directly to Victoria now, ignoring the crowd. I built this life from nothing, from the ashes of what you left behind. I made something of myself despite you, despite Robert, despite everyone who said I'd never amount to anything because of where I came from. And now you want to tear it all down. Now you want to show up and expose everything I've worked to build. I don't want to tear anything down, Victoria said, stepping closer. I want you to do the right thing. I want you to acknowledge this boy, to give him what you needed and never got, a father who shows up, who claims him, who tells the truth even when it's hard. The truth? Jonathan laughed bitterly. You want to talk about truth? Where were you when I needed you? Where were you when Robert's legitimate family was taking me to court, trying to prove I had no claim to anything? Where were you when I was getting bullied at school, when I was eating at soup kitchens because we had no money, when I had to drop out of high school to work? You disappeared, Mom. You chose to leave, and I had to survive without you. So don't lecture me about doing the right thing." The pain in his voice cut through Victoria like a blade. She'd known her abandonment had hurt him, but hearing it laid out like this, in front of all these witnesses, made it real in a way it had never been before. "You're right," she said, her voice breaking. "I failed you. I was weak and scared, and I made a terrible choice. I thought you'd be better off without me, but I was wrong. I was so wrong, Jonathan, and I've paid for that mistake every day for 30 years. But you're not weak. You're not scared. You have power and resources and choices I never had. And you can choose to break the cycle. You can choose to be the father to Daniel that you needed Robert to be." Jonathan looked at Daniel then, really looked at him for the first time. Victoria saw her son's expression shift, saw him recognize something in this boy's face, maybe saw the traces of Elena or himself or the whole complicated web of family resemblance that tied them together. For a moment, just a moment, she thought he might soften, might find some compassion in himself for this child who'd lost his mother and deserved a father. But then his press secretary leaned in, whispered something urgent in his ear, and the shutters came down. The vulnerability disappeared, replaced by the cold calculation of a man who'd built an empire on control and image management. "I'm sorry," Jonathan said, his voice formal and distant, "but I cannot and will not acknowledge false claims made by strangers during a professional event. If you believe you have legitimate legal claims, you're welcome to pursue them through appropriate channels. But this press conference is over." He turned to walk away, his security team moving to surround him, his family following in confused silence. The journalists erupted with questions, shouting over each other, but Jonathan and his team pushed through toward a side exit, clearly planning to evacuate before the situation could get worse. Daniel stood frozen, his face crumbling with the weight of rejection. Victoria pulled him into her arms, holding this brave, heartbroken child while Margaret moved to shield them both from the cameras that were now swinging their direction. This was going to be everywhere within the hour. The homeless grandmother, the abandoned grandson, the billionaire's dark secrets exposed for the world to see. But as the crowd surged around them and security guards tried to clear the room, something unexpected happened. One of the journalists, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a determined expression, pushed through to where Victoria and Daniel stood. "Mrs. Chun," she said quickly, "my name is Patricia Warren from the New York Times. I've been investigating Jonathan Whitmore's background for months, trying to verify his origin story. I have documentation suggesting Robert Whitmore Sr. provided early funding for Jonathan's ventures, but I could never prove the family connection. This photograph, if you're willing to share it, could be the missing piece. And if you're willing to go on record with your story, I can help make sure it's told accurately and fairly." Victoria looked down at Daniel, who was still holding the photograph that had started everything. Her grandson looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. "Is this what you want?" Victoria asked him gently, "Because once we do this, it becomes public. The whole world will know your story, and they'll judge it and dissect it and turn it into entertainment. Are you ready for that?" Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I just wanted him to see me," he said quietly. "I just wanted my father to look at me and admit I exist. But I guess that's not going to happen, is it?" "Maybe not today," Victoria said. "But the truth has a way of maturing eventually, even if he can't acknowledge it right now. You stood up and you told the truth. That takes more courage than anything he's built." Margaret touched Victoria's shoulder. "We should leave before security forces us out," she said practically. "But Patricia's right. This story is going to come out one way or another. Better to control how it's told." Victoria made a decision that would change everything for the second time in her life. The first time, she disappeared to protect her son. This time, she would appear, speak up, tell the truth to protect her grandson. "Okay," she said to Patricia. "We'll talk, but not here. And we need protection, legal advice, somewhere safe to stay while this plays out." Patricia nodded quickly. "I can help with that. The Times has resources, connections. We can keep you safe and make sure your story gets heard." They left the Whitmore Global building through a service exit, avoiding the main lobby where other journalists were gathering. hungry for more details. Patricia drove them to a hotel in Queens, nothing fancy but clean and secure, paid for by the Times in exchange for exclusive access to their story. Over the next several hours, Victoria and Daniel told Patricia everything. The history with Robert Whitmore Sr., Victoria's abandonment and years of homelessness, Daniel's mother Elena, and the settlement agreement Jonathan had made her sign, the research Daniel had conducted to uncover the truth about his father's origins. Patricia took notes, asked careful questions, verified details against her own research. She photographed the documents Daniel had collected, the original pictures, the settlement agreement Elena had saved. By midnight, she had enough for a comprehensive story that would run in the next morning's paper. "This is going to be big," Patricia warned them. "Whitmore's campaign will probably collapse. His business could take a hit. There will be legal threats, probably attempts to discredit you both. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this?" Victoria looked at Daniel, who had fallen asleep on the hotel bed, exhausted from the emotional weight of the day. This brave child had lost so much already. His mother, his chance at a normal life, his father's acknowledgement. But he still had his integrity, his truth, his refusal to be invisible. "I'm sure," Victoria said. "For 30 years, I've been invisible because I was afraid of what facing the truth would cost. But I'm done being afraid. Daniel deserves better, and maybe, somehow, this will help Jonathan face what he's been running from too." The story ran on the front page of the New York Times the next morning. Billionaire gubernatorial candidate's hidden past. Homeless mother and abandoned son expose family secrets. It included the photograph of Victoria holding baby Jonathan with Robert Whitmore Sr. in the background, Daniel's birth certificate showing Jonathan as the father, and Elena's settlement agreement. Patricia had written it carefully, fact-checked and sourced, impossible to dismiss as rumor or speculation. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Social media erupted with debates about privilege and hypocrisy, about family values and political ambition. Other news outlets picked up the story, each adding their own angle. Jonathan's campaign went into crisis mode, releasing a statement that neither confirmed nor denied the allegations, but emphasized his commitment to privacy for all families involved. But the damage was done. Within 48 hours, Jonathan withdrew from the gubernatorial race, citing family considerations. His company's stock took a hit, though it recovered after a few weeks. His wife Catherine gave one interview, saying she was standing by her husband while they worked through complicated family matters, which everyone understood meant she was furious but trapped. What surprised Victoria most was the public reaction to her own story. She'd expected judgment, condemnation for abandoning her son, and there was some of that, particularly in the comment sections and social media threads. But there was also unexpected empathy, particularly from people who understood how poverty and trauma could break a person, how impossible choices sometimes had no good answers. Advocacy groups reached out, wanting to feature her story in campaigns about homelessness and mental health support. Lawyers offered pro bono services to help Daniel establish paternity and claim child support. The church where Margaret volunteered set up a fund to help with their immediate needs, which was overwhelmed by donations within days. 2 weeks after the story broke, Victoria and Daniel were living in a small apartment in Queens, paid for through the donation fund while they figured out their next steps. Margaret had moved in to help care for them both, creating a makeshift family out of necessity and love. Daniel was enrolled in a good public school, had a warm bed and regular meals, was seeing a therapist to help him process his mother's death and his father's rejection. And Victoria was learning how to be visible again, how to exist in the world as a person with a name and a story and a purpose. It was terrifying and exhausting, but it was also healing in ways she hadn't expected. Jonathan hadn't contacted them directly, though his lawyers had. There were negotiations happening about child support, about acknowledgement, about what Jonathan owed to the son he tried to deny. Victoria wasn't part of those conversations by choice. She'd done what she could for Daniel. The rest was between father and son. One evening, 3 weeks after everything had exploded, there was a knock on their apartment door. Margaret answered it while Victoria was making dinner and Daniel was doing homework at the kitchen table. When Margaret returned, her expression was shocked. There's someone here to see you, she said quietly. Both of you. Victoria dried her hands on a towel and walked to the door with Daniel following close behind. Standing in the hallway, looking uncomfortable and out of place in his expensive suit, was Jonathan. He'd aged in the past few weeks, new lines around his eyes, a tiredness in his posture that hadn't been there before. He looked at Victoria first, then at Daniel, his expression unreadable. "Can I come in?" he asked. Victoria stepped aside, letting her son enter the modest apartment. Jonathan looked around, taking in the second-hand furniture and the simple kitchen, the evidence of lives very different from his own. He stood awkwardly in the middle of the living room while Victoria, Daniel, and Margaret waited for him to speak. "I'm not here to apologize," Jonathan said finally. "I'm not ready for that yet. Maybe I'll never be ready. But my therapist suggested I should at least meet with you both, hear your side directly instead of through lawyers and journalists." "You're in therapy?" Victoria asked, surprised. Jonathan laughed without humor. "Catherine insisted. Either I work through my family issues with a professional or she's filing for divorce. Apparently, denying your homeless mother and illegitimate son on live television is bad for a marriage." Daniel stood up from the kitchen table, his homework forgotten. "I don't want your money," he said quietly. "I mean, the child support will help, and I deserve that legally. But that's not why I found you. I just wanted you to know I exist. I wanted to matter to you." Jonathan's jaw clenched. "You matter," he said roughly. "That's the problem. If you didn't matter, this would be easier. I could just write a check and forget about it. But you're my son, and every time I look at you, I see myself at your age. I see what I needed and never got. And it makes me furious, because I've spent my entire adult life making sure I never needed anyone again." "Needing people isn't weakness," Victoria said softly. "I learned that too late, but maybe you don't have to." Jonathan turned to her, and for the first time, she saw real emotion break through his controlled exterior. "You left me," he said, his voice breaking. "You just disappeared one night, and I woke up alone, and I was 13 years old and terrified. I waited for you to come back, kept thinking there must be an explanation, that you'd never just abandon me. But weeks turned into months, turned into years, and you never came back. So I taught myself not to need you. I taught myself not to need anyone, and I built an entire life on that principle." "I know," Victoria said, tears streaming down her face. "I know what I did to you, and I know I can't fix it. But Jonathan, you're doing the same thing to Daniel that was done to you. You're taking your pain and turning it into his pain, and he deserves better than that." Jonathan looked at Daniel, really looked at him, seeing past his own hurt to the child standing in front of him. "You look like your mother," he said quietly. "Elena was kind, genuinely kind in a way most people aren't. I cared about her, but I was too much of a coward to choose her over the life I thought I was supposed to have. And then when she told me she was pregnant, I panicked. I thought a child would ruin everything I'd built." "Did it?" Daniel asked. "Ruin everything?" "No," Jonathan admitted. "Denying you did. Pretending you didn't exist did. Because now everyone knows the truth, and they know I'm a hypocrite who talked about family values while abandoning my own child. But more than that, I know the truth about myself, and I don't like what I see." The room fell silent. Margaret had quietly retreated to the kitchen, giving them space. Victoria wanted to reach out to her son, to comfort him the way she should have done 30 years ago, but she wasn't sure she had the right. "So what happens now?" Daniel asked. Jonathan ran a hand through his hair, looking tired and uncertain. "I don't know," he said honestly. "My lawyer says we need to establish paternity legally, work out custody and support arrangements. My therapist says I need to take responsibility and build a relationship with you if you're willing. My wife says I need to figure out who I actually am underneath all the image and ambition, and I don't have good answers for any of it." "Maybe you could start by just showing up," Victoria suggested gently. "Not as a billionaire or a political candidate or someone trying to manage the situation. Just as Daniel's father. Have dinner with him sometimes. Ask about school. Be present in the small ways that matter." Jonathan looked skeptical. "I don't know how to do that." I never learned how to be that kind of father because I never had that kind of father. Then learn, Daniel said, his voice stronger now. I'll teach you what I need if you actually listen. But you have to choose to be here. I'm not going to beg for your attention or prove that I'm worth your time. Either you want to know me or you don't. Victoria felt pride surge through her at her grandson's words. This child had more emotional maturity at 12 than most adults managed in a lifetime. He'd been hurt and rejected, but he hadn't let it break him. He was setting boundaries, asking for what he deserved, refusing to settle for crumbs. Jonathan stared at Daniel for a long moment, and Victoria could see the war happening behind his eyes. The part of him that wanted to run, to protect himself, to maintain the walls he'd built so carefully, and the part of him that recognized himself in this child, that maybe wanted something more than the cold success he'd achieved. Okay, Jonathan said finally. I'll try. I can't promise I'll be good at it, and I'll probably mess it up a lot, but I'll try to show up. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. It wasn't a fairy tale ending where all the hurt dissolved and they became a happy family. But it was a beginning, fragile and uncertain, built on honesty instead of denial. Jonathan left 20 minutes later, promising to call Daniel the next day to set up a time to have lunch together. When the door closed behind him, Daniel turned to Victoria with cautious hope on his face. "Do you think he means it?" he asked. "I don't know," Victoria said honestly. "But he came here, which is more than I expected. And sometimes showing up is the first step toward meaning it." Over the following weeks and months, Jonathan did show up. Awkwardly at first, clearly uncomfortable with the vulnerability required for real connection. But he kept coming. He had lunch with Daniel every Sunday. He attended a school event when Daniel was part of a science fair presentation. He hired a tutor to help with math, set up a college fund, made sure Daniel had everything he needed materially. The emotional connection took longer. Jonathan struggled with softness, with admitting mistakes, with being anything other than controlled and competent. But Daniel was patient in a way that humbled Victoria. Her grandson had decided to give his father a chance, and he held space for Jonathan's fumbling attempts at parenthood with grace and honesty. Jonathan's relationship with Victoria was more complicated. They met for coffee a few times, stilted conversations, where they tried to bridge 30 years of silence and hurt. She didn't ask for forgiveness, because she knew she didn't deserve it. He didn't offer it because he wasn't ready. But they were talking, which was something. Catherine eventually filed for divorce, unable to reconcile with the man her husband had revealed himself to be. The legitimate children, Amanda and Robert, struggled with learning their father had a secret half-brother and a grandmother they'd never known. The family fractured in some ways, but in other ways, it became more honest. The donation fund that had been set up for Victoria and Daniel's immediate needs grew beyond anything they could have imagined. Victoria used some of it to start a small advocacy program for homeless women, partnering with the church where Margaret volunteered. She understood now that her story could help other people, that her mistakes and survival could mean something beyond just personal shame. Daniel thrived in his new school, made friends, joined a robotics club, slowly rebuilt a childhood that had been stolen by loss and abandonment. He talked to a therapist about his mother, about grief, about what it meant to have a father who was trying but imperfect. He was healing, not because everything was fixed, but because someone had finally seen him and said he mattered. 6 months after the press conference that had changed everything, Victoria sat in a small coffee shop in Queens with Patricia Warren, the journalist who'd first helped tell their story. Patricia was working on a follow-up piece about what had happened to them since the truth came out. "Do you regret it?" Patricia asked. "Going public with everything? Your life is completely different now, more visible, more complicated." Victoria thought about the question carefully. Her life was definitely more complicated. She had people recognizing her on the street, advocacy groups wanting her to speak at events, constant attention from a world that had ignored her for years. It was overwhelming sometimes, exhausting in ways that being invisible had never been. But she also had an apartment with her grandson, had Margaret who'd become family, had a purpose that got her out of bed each morning. She had Sunday lunches with her son that were awkward but real. She had a chance to help other people who were struggling the way she had struggled. No, Victoria said finally. I don't regret it. For 30 years, I let fear and shame control my life. I disappeared because I thought that's what my son needed. And then I stayed disappeared because I was too afraid to face what I'd done. But Daniel taught me something important. He showed me that telling the truth, even when it's hard, even when it costs you something, is the only way to actually live. And I'd rather live messily and visibly than hide perfectly and alone. Patricia smiled and made a note. That's a good quote, she said. Can I use it? Sure, Victoria said. At this point, my whole life is a quote. They both laughed, and Victoria felt something she hadn't felt in decades, lightness. The weight of secrets and shame that had pressed on her chest for so long had lifted, replaced by something closer to peace. Not perfect peace, not the absence of pain or regret, but the peace that comes from finally being honest about who you are and what you've done. That evening, Victoria walked home through the Queen's neighborhood that was slowly becoming familiar. She passed the bodega, where the owner now greeted her by name, the playground where she sometimes sat and watched Daniel play basketball with his new friends, the church where Margaret volunteered and Victoria had started attending services. When she reached the apartment, she found Daniel at the kitchen table doing homework while Margaret cooked dinner. It was ordinary and domestic, and completely different from the corner, where she'd sat for 3 years, with a cardboard sign and a cup for change. "Grandma," Daniel said, looking up from his math textbook, "can you help me with this problem?" Victoria sat down beside him, looking at the equations that made no sense to her. "I have no idea how to do that," she admitted, "but let's figure out together." And that, Victoria thought, was maybe the most important lesson she'd learned through all of this. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to be perfect or always know the right thing to do. You just have to show up, be honest, and try to figure it out together. The truth had cost them all something. Jonathan had lost his political ambitions and some of his carefully crafted image. Victoria had lost her invisibility and the strange safety that came with having nothing to protect. Daniel had lost a fantasy that finding his father would solve all his problems. But what they'd gained was worth more than what they'd lost. They'd gained truth, messy and complicated as it was. They'd gained each other, imperfect family bound together by honesty instead of pretense. And they'd gained the possibility of something better, something real, something built on who they actually were instead of who they pretended to be. Did truth always win in the end? Victoria didn't know. The world was more complicated than simple moral equations. But she knew that for her, for Daniel, for their small assembled family, choosing truth over comfortable lies had opened a door to something that felt like hope. And after 30 years in the dark, hope was enough. What's your story? Have you ever had to choose between a comfortable lie and a hard truth? Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply be seen for who we really are.